Hey everybody, how's it going? Thanks for joining me this afternoon. I've got a great stream with a great guest that I think you're really going to enjoy. Curtis Yarvin has burst onto the scene. He's in the New York Times. He's getting all these big splashy articles about how he's the architect of the new regime. He's the thought leader. He's the court philosopher of the Trump presidency. But there's another neo-reactionary philosopher who had a big impact on the movement, and his ideas might actually be more prominent than many people realize. In fact, he might have won the election in the way that Trump didn't. Joining me today to discuss that is Patrick Casey. He is a columnist and the host of the Restoring Order podcast. Thanks for joining me, man.
It's great to be back, Auron. Thank you.
Absolutely. So you have recently, I think, been falling further down the Nick Land rabbit hole. It is a weird, esoteric journey, but it is one that I think ultimately is very valuable. What sparked your interest? Why are you suddenly focusing on Nick Land's work?
Sure. So I've been interested in Nick Land for years, but it's an on again, off again. Sometimes I don't know. I don't know. The inspiration strikes. Maybe it's AI in the future compelling me to become interested in this. Nick Land has many ideas of that sort. I don't actually believe that, for the record, but I have been thinking about the rise of the tech right, and there's Nick Land offers a lot of insights into that. I think no one else really offers with regard to what's happening here. So I'm sure we'll be getting into that and other stuff.
Yeah, I mean, obviously, Curtis Yarvin talks about the CEO monarch, right? And a lot of people could look at someone like Trump, who is himself, of course, a very successful businessman, or the support, obviously, of someone like Elon Musk, one of the richest men or the richest man in the world, depending on the day. This is obviously a scenario that Yarvin wrote about. However, he doesn't spend a lot of time on technology. He doesn't focus on that aspect of what is happening. And the fact that Trump has really promoted guys like Sachs, guys like Andreessen, guys like Musk to very important spots. These are guys who are assisting him and in many cases directly advising. Obviously, he's got other guys like Bezos and Zuckerberg lining up behind him. This is obviously, there's something about his presidency that really incentivizes the tech industry to be behind him. We see the big push for artificial intelligence as part of Trump's presidency. What aspects of that do you feel play into Land's philosophy?
Sure. So I think first we gotta be very upfront about the fact that the tech right, this phenomenon of all of these tech guys, a number of the ones you've mentioned, some you didn't, joining up with Trump. If you go back to 2016, that would have been unthinkable. So this is an incredibly, I would say, historic, certainly significant phenomenon. It's a big counterfactual, but I don't know, Auron, if Trump would have won the 2024 election if he didn't have Elon's money, if Elon Musk's buying Twitter didn't, free up some of the dissemination of information, and also the money and support from other people in the tech world. So it's not the only factor, but one of the main factors, and it's a huge shift. So what does Nick Land have to offer there? Well, there are a few ways you can look at these tech elites moving rightward. You can look at it on an individual level. You can say, okay, these guys are, just individually kind of thought, well, I'd be better off with Trump. I'm getting harassed by the government. I'd have lower taxes. Yeah, and that's absolutely the case. I mean, these are individuals making decisions. Okay, well, you could zoom out a little bit and see things from somewhat of a bigger picture perspective, maybe a Burnhamite, James Burnham perspective, and say, okay, this is a class, kind of almost like a class struggle. I know it sounds a little bit Marxist, but, the billionaire class versus the managerial, or perhaps more accurately, the bureaucrat class. One thing Burnham got right was over the course of the 20th century, there would be more and more government oversight over business. One might even refer to that as the total state. I hear there's a great book on the subject, of course, referring to yours. Right, and that's a valid perspective as well, because if you look at Elon Musk, just as one example, the government was launching all of these investigations into him. He got hit with civil rights lawsuits. Some guy at Tesla claimed that he was the victim of racism, not like from Elon Musk directly, but you have this whole thing called hostile work environment. Okay, next thing you know, Elon Musk's company is shelling over, hundreds of millions or whatever it was. So, and Zuckerberg being dragged in, getting harassed from both the right and the left over censoring too much, too little. I think you did have a lot of tech people that just kind of decided, like, as a class, like, okay, our interests are not really aligned with this managerial regime. There's too much oversight. We don't have the freedom to do what we want. So that's the kind of the class way of looking at it, and I think that's very valid. Now, there's the Landian perspective, which is what I've been thinking about lately, and I haven't seen a lot of other people discuss. I'm sure someone who's as familiar with his work as you are is probably, I'm sure I'm going to be preaching to the choir, but I think the audience will hopefully get a lot out of this. So what Nick Land's big thing is, when he talks about accelerationism, he's talking about a process that was kind of almost like a monster that was unleashed during the Renaissance. A number of things happened during the Renaissance with the rise of capitalism. Somewhere around that time, you had double entry bookkeeping, the joint stock exchange, some of these sorts of things. And it was almost like all of these guardrails on this process were removed. What is that process? Well, it's the acceleration of techno-capitalism. Sometimes he just refers to it as capitalism. He also refers to it other ways, but that's a good way of looking at it. Is there's this positive feedback loop. The more capitalism you do, the more technological innovation you get. The more technological innovation you get, the more capitalism. And that just kind of, we're at the beginning of an exponential or a logistic curve. We're still like relatively early. Technological progression, some would say, was linear. Prior to that, it just was kind of going straight up. Maybe that's not entirely the case. So the point is there is this process that was kind of unleashed during the Renaissance of technological and capitalistic growth. And it's really a battle between deregulation and the state, where you have the state kind of, a lot of what the state does is try to inhibit or redirect that process of growth. And I think there's, from a Landian perspective, and I'll leave off here for now, there's no way you can look at the 2024 election and not conclude that this was a huge victory for that process, right? This accelerationist process that is totally restructuring society, that is taking us, in Land's view, closer to the obsolescence of human beings, right? He has that famous quote that I'm probably going to butcher, but, nothing human makes it out on the other side, something to that effect. The idea that eventually we will reach the singularity, man will be phased out, it will just be AI and robots or something of the sort, which is a future I find horrific, just to be clear. Nick Land might think that's cool. I'm interested in Land from like a descriptive, how can we understand this process kind of perspective. I don't really share the same values as him beyond that, though.
Yeah, and Land has softened that language in recent interviews, so it's difficult to know how much he still holds to some of that. But as you point out, the descriptive aspect of his work is really the most interesting. I think it's really important there that you layered in the comparison between Burnham's analysis and Land's, because I think they actually intersect in a very interesting way in this process. So I had this thought and I shared it with Land, and the nice thing about the modern era is your favorite philosopher will just pop in on Twitter and comment on things that you're talking about. But I floated this idea to him that the managerial elite were kind of the last piece of human safety software on technology, that they were kind of this final barrier, this last ditch effort to try to recapture the capital process. And when you talk about that tension between kind of the venture capitalist class, the tech right, and the managerial class, what we're seeing in a way is the fact that, the managerial class, while they're very inhuman in a lot of what they've done, they have become so in an effort to capture what is going on, to re-territorialize it, to bring it back into the interests of specific people, specific groups, specific nations, the material interests, these kind of things. And the fact that these two things are at war, and as Burnham talked about this, and Francis talked about this later on, Sam Francis, that these two classes were at war with each other, that the capitalist and the managerial, even though we, and especially the left thinks of these as like the same thing, right? Oh, it's just all the rich people, it's all the all people capitalism. But there's actually a real tension between the managerial part of the apparatus and those that are founding these organizations, making the money, the CEOs.
Yeah.
These are very different interests, which creates a lot of the dynamic we see today. But another step in that is that if guys like Elon, guys like Andreessen, many of these other people want to free themselves from many of the restrictions that the managerial class places on them, the kind of things that are very human, even if they are a warped version of humanity like wokeness, they need to find ways around the existence of that current interest group. And I think this is one of the reasons that AI is such a priority for these guys. I think they want to replace the managerial class with AI, allowing them to scale and make these big, interesting advances in technology without having to answer to a whole bureaucratic morass that enables all the things that allow them to launch rockets. You need a lot of civilization between nothing and rockets, and the civilization's great, but it also hinders a lot of what Elon wants to do. So wouldn't it be great if I could just automate all that civilization so I can get back to launching rockets? I think that is actually a big part of what is happening here. And so the fact that land in many ways kind of predicted this movement, this desire of capital to free itself from these very particular human interests, and we're kind of seeing that in a way play out in the way that the tech right is pushing forward, I think is pretty fascinating.
Yeah, it's absolutely fascinating. I couldn't agree more. So one thing that I wanted to touch on here, and it's relevant to what you were saying, you mentioned Marc Andreessen. So he was on Joe Rogan. It was a pretty interesting interview. And one of the things he said was, look, there used to be kind of this arrangement between Silicon Valley tech elites and the kind of liberal regime that, you know, they get their sandbox. They get to play there. They get to do their thing. They get to innovate, whatever, as long as I forget exactly what he said, but donate to charities, you know, as long as they do kind of like the bare minimum that the liberal regime expected. But over time, the expectations and requirements of the liberal regime became, they grew, and both in, like, you know, number and intensity, to the point where, you know, tech elites don't really feel like, okay, we just got to, you know, play nice with society and we get our, you know, you don't get your sandbox anymore, right? The total state has infiltrated the sandbox. And so that's a big part of the reason why they obviously chose to do this. Now, again, that's looking at it as the individual perspective. The Landian perspective is there's been this process that's been happening for hundreds of years, the acceleration, this positive feedback loop, technology, capitalism working together. And that like any attempt to stifle or restrict that is going to be, it's going to be a battle. And in that sense, sure, you are, you know, if you're trying to restrict that, you are going to run up against human beings whose interests are aligned with that force. But you are fighting a force, right? This process is perhaps a better way of looking at it that's been around since the Renaissance at the very least. So that's how I view that sandbox quote is, okay, so you had this process, it was allowed to continue, but it just got to the point where there were too many restrictions on it. Yeah. One thing you were saying about, which was really important here, is about, you know, Nick Land is always talking about, he's talking about the people, he has these futuristic, what was it, Cyber Revolution was one of the chapters in Fang Numina, one of the essays, and it's the one in which he puts forward like it's like a dialogue. They're talking about a future in which these K-revolutionaries, like cyber revolutionaries, are going to war with like people that are consciously seeing themselves aligned with this process of acceleration, and they're like straight up going to war with the government, which represents, it's like the pro-tech side and the pro-human side. And you know, I don't know if things are exactly going to play out that way. I certainly hope not. But the pro-human side, that's what Nick Land says, that's basically what leftism is. And you mentioned that even though these people they're pro-human in like a demented way, right? Not in a way that we would as actual right-wingers. But that's worth considering, because a big part of the of what this managerial elite stands for, at least claims to stand for, some people promoting this are doing it cynically, is is right, obviously, that there are differences, that the inequality, the idea that capitalism, and they're correct, capitalism creates a lot of inequality. I would also argue that it raises the standard of living overall. So you're not going to have a totally equal society, but everyone overall, like, it's better to be poor in America than it is to be, in most cases, than it is to be middle class in, some like total third world country, right?
Right.
Middle class people from those countries would love to be existing at the bottom strata of our society. So the point of that is that is like a very pro-human perspective, but just kind of an egalitarian one. They're saying, oh, capitalism and technology and these rich billionaires, they're not doing enough for inequality. That we saw how things played out. That didn't. This has been a huge win for the process of acceleration and for the billionaire class. So it's in the short term, it's been a win for us. I guess I'll leave it there for now, but it is worth considering maybe some of the long-term ramifications of this new alliance.
Well, and speaking of course, we both know that we have had a little bit of a knockdown and drag out with some of the tech right here in the last few months. Many people who are more nationalistic, people who are more traditional, religious, these are forces that, well, as you point out, the tech right is incredibly important. I very much agree with you that Donald Trump probably would not have been elected if Elon had not bought Twitter. Just that act alone. Everything else, the money, all that stuff is also helpful, but just the fact that all of the news could get to the people unfiltered was such an amazing change in the dynamic, the American electoral dynamic, that I think that kind of completely changed the game. It completely shook up the board and allowed Trump to get that second victory. So obviously, these are people who are key to this coalition. We're not blind to that fact, and I'm very happy that Elon ultimately has made those moves, even if I disagree with him. But disagreements we have, and many of those disagreements are centered around the fact that the tech right doesn't seem very pro-human in the sense of worrying about, say, protecting a nation, protecting the actual people of the nation, seeing the United States as not a sports team, not a business, not a economic zone, but as a real place where people live, where they raise their children, where they create generations of tradition and habit and custom that bind them together and make a real people. They don't see the world that way. The world, and it has to be when you're operating at this level, but for them, the world is just a set of pieces to rearrange, right? It's how do I move the world around so I can launch the next rocket? How do I move the world around so I can make the next advancement? And that's how you have to think when you're doing great things. But it also means that you say things out loud like, we need infinite HB1 visas because Americans are too stupid to program computers. Like you kind of vomit rhetoric like that. And so we have this kind of standoff between these forces, which you're right to point out. Even though both of us recognize the importance of Land's work and the predictive power that we're kind of watching unfold, it also points us to a possible conflict of interest in a future that ultimately we aren't moving towards. Again, that's kind of the value of real philosophy. You can read Plato without wanting the state to take children from people at 7 years old and train them to brainwash them. You can read Nick Land without ultimately being like, well, I want to replace every part of my body with a cyborg, whatever. And so his philosophy is very useful, but it does point us to a conflict inside the MAGA coalition that is probably only going to continue to grow.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. The H-1B debate was revealed some of the fault lines in this new coalition. Now, I will say, I don't know if you actually get to choose your elites. I think that just providence or fortuna, historical circumstance kind of, gives you, that's what you have, right? You don't get to, you and I, even if we, I do really like Elon. I do have some disagreements. The H-1B thing is an example, but if you and I decided, well, we don't want Elon anymore, we want some other billionaire. Okay, well, it's kind of, even if 10,000 of us decided that, well, that's kind of just not gonna, well, we want some other billionaire to be president other than Trump. Okay, well, it's not. I don't, for the record, but you just kind of play the hand you're dealt, right? So Yeah, we're going to have these disagreements, and I think it's important to keep that in mind. We should be very thankful, but we shouldn't, we shouldn't shy away from disagreeing when necessary. I think like attacking and insulting these people is not the right way to go about it. And in fact, I think that makes having these discussions, people who are, if you're the richest man in the world and you're getting insulted, just nastily on Twitter, that's probably going to make you less. Probably going to double down. I think that's a lot of what happened that debate is people just doubled down on their takes because they were getting insulted and they were like, well, screw you. So now when you said that, Elon and a lot of these tech guys, they want to launch rockets. They don't want whatever gets in the way of that basically is the obstacle. Okay. Well, let's going back to this process of acceleration that we've been talking about. Any guardrails, any Nick Land has some other great metaphors here that I'm drawing a blank on, but any obstacles to that, anything that impedes that process is kind of the enemy. So now, but there are some things that we could point to that are, well, I'm generally pro-capitalism, that I wouldn't want to happen, that might be good for that process. So while I think that we are along for the ride, I don't think we can stop this process. I do think we are given choices of like different versions of, we're going to have a future that's more technologically advanced, but I don't think there's only one more technologically advanced future. I think there are ones where America is stronger, is healthier, and there are certainly more technologically advanced versions of the future where, America's weaker. You do have more mass migration. So, and that process, right, it deterritorializes. I know you've covered this aspect of Land's work. He borrows it from two other philosophers, Deleuze and Guattari. The idea that as this process of capitalism, of technological advancement goes on, it breaks down social boundaries, social orders, entire social orders. Just look at what happened to the Ancien regime. And that's kind of like what we're kind of concerned about. We don't want America to be destroyed in the process demographically, culturally, spiritually. And I think, again, if you're going to have this technological growth and progress, you're going to get some of that. But like I said, I think we can kind of steer things a little bit, but we can't stop the process. And that's something we have to largely accept.
Yeah, I think that is pretty critical. Again, one of the most famous Land quotes is the only way out is through, right? And ultimately, we can't go back. We aren't returning with a V. There is going to be technological advancement. We will have to interact with it at some level. And so the question is how to do that in the interests of the United States for the good of the people. Now, again, that's something that Land might not like. He doesn't want monkey business. He doesn't want those human limitations, those human interests, hamstringing what's going on.
Right.
But with that insight, we can at least recognize that this process is struggling to occur. And we can do our best to try to steer it. As you said, can never completely control it, can never completely stop it. But we can recognize that it is ongoing and something that we should be thinking about. Interestingly, one of the things that Land says in his work is one of the most interesting parts of accelerationism is it collapses decision space. It reduces the amount of time that you have to think about things because the developments happen more rapidly and there's less and less time for you to interact with developments before you move to the next one. So if you are not prepared, if you are not well out ahead of this stuff, if you don't have kind of this axiomatic understanding of everything we do needs to be for the sake of American people, for the betterment of the American people, then you won't have time to turn that ship when the next problem comes. And that's one thing I wanted to bring in because I was just at the ARC conference in London, Jordan Peterson's conference, and one of the main focuses on this was AI and technological development. I found the politics actually to be relatively kind of behind. In a lot of ways, America is well ahead of kind of the European trend. Most of the Europeans I spoke to there were wishing they could catch up to what was happening in the United States politically. But one thing that was really focused on was technology. A lot of speeches about this. Peter Thiel giving a very interesting attack on kind of Descartes' kind of Cartesian dualism. Really found that the idea that people were separate minds was very dangerous in the world of AI because it meant that you basically had to attribute humanity to artificial intelligence. And so they were really tackling some of the higher level problems that come with a lot of the
Interesting.
technological advancements. Eric Weinstein gave a very interesting speech, which sounded like he ripped it right out of Curtis Yarvin, and he just renamed everything. Like he just relabeled the cathedral like the disc or something,
There
and
you
he
go.
relabeled fifth generation warfare as something else. But basically, there's a very big and real concern from, I think, some pretty top level decision makers on both kind of the center and right, that what is coming down the pipeline technologically is going to radically change the nature of states, if not the way that humans live their lives.
Yeah.
And if we're not prepared for that, if we're not thinking about that, if we're not already realizing that we're existing in a world where large amounts of technological algorithmic egregores are kind of altering the way that we think about our nationhood and our interests, then we will be completely driven by a process that is inhuman.
Yeah, that's absolutely the case. So, yeah, the thing with AI is very interesting as well. I read a good book last year, The Coming Wave by Mustafa Suleyman. He was a high up Google AI guy, went off to found his own country. So definitely, at the top of the AI game. And, he's someone he's come out and basically said, and this is very relevant to land, as you'll see, that he thinks that we should try to contain AI. But he also doesn't think we can really do it. But he thinks the ramifications of not, like, you just got to try, even if there's a 1% chance of doing it. So it's kind of fascinating that some of these people are sort of reaching Landian conclusions on their own, that like you kind of can't stop it. But if you look at what the consequences of not containing it, not stopping it, but containing it, guiding its progress, then some of these ramifications could be pretty bad. One thing he talks about in that book as well is that it's not just like AI that we're on the cusp of. He talks about waves of technological development where you have a bunch of different technologies at once that come into being. He's talking about quantum computing, nanocomputers, obviously AI, robotics, that over the course of our lifetimes, we'll probably see. It's not just like one thing that's going to be, it's just like a whole new era that we're going to be entering into. And we're definitely there. I mean, we're both millennials, I believe. I remember growing up without smartphones, and I know that's kind of a boomer thing, all the smartphone, but like it has absolutely altered quite a bit about what it means to be human. Dating, things like, I mean, almost every form of social participation has kind of declined, and people want to attribute. There are certainly multiple factors, but like the internet, TV, computer. All of these are big factors. So these are things just over the course of our lifetime, and we're not old. Contrary to what the Zoomers watching might think. Yeah, now Auron and I, we're in the prime of our youths here. But it's kind of crazy to think even like 30 something years, we've seen like new technologies get introduced, totally change things. So over the course of the next like 50 or whatever years, we're gonna see some crazy stuff. And the question again, I just go back to, I think we have multiple options on the way. It's like you're playing Civilization or something. Okay, you get to the next stage, you still have choices of like how that next stage is going to play out. And I think the immigration angle is really an important one, because having like not wildly rupturing and altering your country's demographics is an essential part of maintaining your country as a nation. And now at this point, demanding that America is like totally ethnically or racially pure, that's like, it's just not going to happen. There's going to be some diversity, but future waves of immigration, that's definitely something that we can do to stop. And I think it's easy when we talk about the kind of the inevitability of this techno capital acceleration. We got to be careful to not say that certain things happening now that that could be perceived to be inevitable, inevitable parts of that process. We got to make sure that we don't say that they are if they're not. So like, the Cato sorts of people making arguments for legal immigration. Oh, this is just, the market, it's the invisible hand. Okay, well, there can be short-term economic gains. And, when it comes to illegal immigration, a lot of these, it's just like goes to the businesses. These GDP gains, they go to the businesses, they go to the illegals, don't really go to the actual, most Americans. So you gotta put that, into perspective. But what I'm getting at here is, if we're at the cusp of this automation revolution, Why are we bringing in like cheap laborers? No, it
Right,
doesn't
right.
make any sense. There's still room for choosing. And in fact, some of these things might actually maybe the pro tech, the accelerationist perspective is actually to have less immigration for these reasons. With ChatGPT and the rise of AI, do we need tons of cheap H-1B workers? And the answer is no, and we probably never did. And do we need tons of cheap farm laborers? No, we've got, you even talk to anyone who works in agriculture, even the last decade or two, machinery and tech in general has rendered obsolete some of these positions. So we need to lean into the technology angle a little bit more. Now, with that said, there are still going to be downsides to things like automation. Tucker Carlson, I remember his interview with Andrew Yang. They're talking about, one of the most common jobs for non-college whites is truck driving. Okay, well, what happens when AI drives trucks? Well, Andrew Yang in his book, he thinks all these truck drivers are going to become like white nationalist guerrillas trying to overthrow the government. Okay, I don't think that's the case. Certainly wouldn't support anything of the sort. But to the extent that we can account for some of these changes, there's got to be like something for these sorts of people to do. And the last I'll say is, we got to not bring in more people who are, not going to have jobs. This kind of lower, immigrant underclass is just going to turn to crime. That's kind of what happened when there's nothing to do. And that's a big thing that happened in Europe, where they brought all of these migrants over. And unlike in America, they're not really put to work. What do? They just sit around on welfare committing crimes. So I think that we can account for some of these changes, not entirely, but, to the extent that we can, we should.
Yeah, it's really important that you point out the kind of tension between the technological advancements and the immigration question, because so much of what we've heard is that immigrants make the United States run. We just wouldn't be able to do anything without them. They pick all the food. Who will pick the cotton, right? Like, this is kind of the approach. No matter how economically callous that is, this is what we hear from the people who are supposed to be the most compassionate people in the world. Is, well, if no one's out there delivering my food, at slave labor wages, then how will I get my whatever delivered to my apartment at 3 a.m. in New York? Like, this is why we need infinite immigration.
Right.
But as you point out, if we are planning to phase out so many of these jobs, if so many of these agricultural jobs, so many of these manual labor jobs are going to be automated very quickly, then there is literally not only no reason, but it's disadvantageous to the entire United States to do this. You are setting up a dependent class that is immediately going to need to be given welfare, retrained. You're going to have to find something for them to do, or like you said, it's going to turn to crime. And it really destroys any arguments. The technology really destroys any arguments ultimately, even for, I think, moderately skilled immigration, the stuff like the H-1Bs that we're supposed to be getting. Because why does any engineer in India need to move to the United States if I have a Skype call and email? Like, it just, no one has explained, literally zero people have explained to me why I need to physically relocate a guy who works only on digital material and can communicate with anyone anywhere simultaneously without, and instantaneously. Like, it makes no sense. And yet we're told, no, we have to move these people in. So the technology is its own argument against a large amount of immigration. And I think that's pretty critical. There's a larger question, as you point out, with some of the native population of the United States. As we automate away these jobs, what do they do? But obviously, if anyone is going to get any kind of welfare, job retraining, any of these things, ultimately, it should be the people who are native to the United States. It's the people who hold the jobs, who built the infrastructure that allowed for the automation in the first place. If there's any people who should be supported by the government as they try to transition to something else, it should ultimately be those people. Now, I think there is a danger in UBI. I think ultimately that is, the grain dole. It goes all the way back to ancient Rome. It goes all, it's a classic subsidization of a population that gets phased out. At first, the Romans were farmers. Every citizen was a farmer. But over time, you got enough slave labor. The farm labor of the average Roman became obsolete. So they had to put those obsolete workers on the grain dole. in order to support them. This just slowly degraded the quality of Roman life. So, it's not exactly the same thing, but we've seen this process before. There's really nothing new under the sun, even though the technological aspect is different from, say, the consolidation of farms or whatever in Rome. We can see this pattern play out. So ultimately, I don't think that this is a good thing, and we need to find solutions for Americans who are being impacted by this kind of advancement. But the other really interesting things that this technology does is it allows for possibly different political organizations, right? Like, one of the reasons we currently have to centralize government as heavily as we do is that massification and kind of volume is its own powerful effect. You need the force multiplier of just the sheer scale and size in order to compete with places like China or these kind of other countries.
Sure.
But what if the Singapore model became something that was very easy for everyone to do? What if the technological advancements of AI and automation allow for the localization of more capitalistic and governmental processes, because you no longer have to centralize everything across an entire continent in order to generate the scale and advantage that it brings?
Sure.
These are advantages that could come with this technological advancement and could ultimately move the interests of people who are more nationalistically minded, without, so it's not all downside. There are downsides, but as you say, whether it's addressing the immigration issue or the centralization of government or phasing out the managerial elite, there are possible upsides to this advancement that could help people who have a more traditional mindset.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, we talked about how this process was kind of this monster, so to speak, was, and I say that without any real, value judgment. It is a very powerful force, was unleashed from its, it was let out of the box, so to speak, during the Renaissance. Well, I'm sorry, the trads won't like this, but a lot of great stuff happened after the Renaissance. I mean, you look at...
That can't be true, Patrick. It can't be true.
You're a Protestant. Maybe, it's okay for you to say that.
Okay.
My fellow Catholics will give me a hard time. But yeah, I mean, you look at the age of exploration, like the colonialism, scientific revolution, these sorts of things. Like, yeah, the age of like European dominance of the globe, which I'm not calling for anything like that, so to speak. But, there have been like great eras of our civilization that have in large part come from like being the first to discover this force, to harness it. And, so it's not something that, we shouldn't be too pessimistic about things, but it will be a wild ride. And like I said, just even in my lifetime, just seeing the changes brought by smartphones and so forth. But, McLuhan, who is the great, philosopher, intellectual of technology, his thing, he focused on technological mediums and the way that the introduction of these new mediums changes society, right? So his famous phrase, the medium is the message. The point was like introducing the TV to society will have a greater effect on society than whatever you're playing on the TV. Not that the content doesn't matter, but that the form precedes content. Mm-hmm. And, but his takeaway was like, okay, once you understand these technological mediums and the way they change people, the way they impact and reshape what it is to be human, then you have like, you're able to reap the benefits and kind of minimize to some extent, maybe not ever entirely, the downsides of the introduction of these new technological mediums. So I think if you zoom out and apply that to technology overall, yeah, I think that's the case. I don't think that, all regulation is bad now. And Nick Land has had some pretty explicit tweets saying that's like a communist perspective to have. I'm sorry, Mr. Land, but yeah, so that's just how I view it. Yeah, it's gonna be a wild ride, but we do have a choice in the type of technologically advanced future that we have, and I think we should be talking, especially discussions within this MAGA coalition about what we want that future to look like.
Well, we've confirmed that Patrick Casey is a communist. Nick Land, would recognize that online. But yeah, no, I think ultimately it is critical for us to, again, we know that the technology is coming. We know that these advancements are going to happen. We know this process is ongoing. We know the tech right is going to continue to play a critical role in what's happening. And it really is, to the extent that we can, our job to turn these things towards the good, to recognize that they can be forces for good, that they can be something that can help people, that can help the United States. But we have to keep that focus. We have to remain vigilant, remind people that, the only reason that they're able to achieve the things they're achieving is that the American people are behind them, that a great country and a great people are ultimately the incubator that is giving birth to what they are growing. And I think ultimately that is a battle that can be won. Because like you said, I disagree with Elon on a number of things, but ultimately I think the things that he has done are good. I think he has better political instincts than many of our elites have for a long time. And I think that working with and helping people like him better understand things that will help Americans flourish is critical. And so I think it's important to continue up that effort. And as you said, do it in a way that is, we're standing our ground, we're making a point, we're standing on principle, but also we're not burning bridges. We recognize a friend that can be persuaded when we see one. We don't always have to go to the mat and start a shooting war in order to make a point and help people understand and evaluate interests that are important to different parts of the coalition. So that said, I probably should have said earlier, this is we are taping this early, so sorry, can't answer any questions today from the chat. If you did a super chat, I appreciate it, but I can't get to it today. Thank you very much, of course. And Patrick, it's been great talking to you. Is there anywhere you would like people to go? Anything you want people to check out? Anything you're working on?
Sure. So I do the weekly podcast. Half of it is on X. Half of it's available for free on my Substack. Full thing for subscribers. They can go to patrickcasey.com for that. They can also follow me on X at Restore Order USA. And yeah, those are the two main places.
Excellent. Well, make sure that you are listening to Restoring Order. And if it is your first time on this channel, you need to go ahead and subscribe, click the bell notifications so you know that we're going live when the stream is live. And of course, if you would like to get these broadcasts as podcasts, then you need to subscribe to the Auron MacIntyre Show on your favorite podcast platform. If you do leave a rating or a review, it always helps with the algorithm, which obviously we know is ruling everything. Thank you, everybody, for watching. And as always, we will talk to you next time.